Welcome to the Fleet Geeks podcast. We're here to help develop fleet and transport professionals. Do you want to progress and develop your skills and knowledge? We promise to bring lively conversation and debate around interesting issues and keep you bang up to date with changes in our awesome industry. The Fleet Geeks are a community of professionals, and if you enjoy the podcast, why not join the discussion for free in the Fleet Geek community over on Facebook.
So the red light is rolling, and I'm absolutely delighted to be joined for a second podcast. Look at me, I can't even put my teeth in properly today. I'm joined again by Lisa, who kindly did a podcast, which those who have listened will have heard last week. And if you haven't listened, please do go back and check that. And we did a podcast last week, but just for the benefit of people who are listening to this for the first time, Lisa, are you able to just do a quick introduction for them, please?
Hi, everybody. I'm Lisa Dorn. I work as an associate professor at Cranfield University, and I also I'm founder of a company called SideDrive, so do look that up, and most of my expertise is focused on driver behaviour. Fantastic.
And I really appreciate you taking the time out from your busy schedule, Lisa, to be able to help us record the series of podcasts. So the first one we did looked at workload, and in this session we're going to be looking at skills fade. In the next podcast we'll look at distraction as well, just to keep people a little bit engaged and not distracted, but we're going to stick with skills fade for now. So first of all, I suppose the question is what's a good explanation? What is skills fade, and why is that an issue in the context of driving, for example?
Okay, so one of the issues for the development of driving skills is that often you develop them over a very short period of time, perhaps through license acquisition. You know, if you're trying to acquire a license either for a category B or for driving a truck, and that period of increasing your skills and knowledge around driving any kind of vehicle often happens under what's called mask practice. That is, you know, it's a very short period of time that you're acquiring those skills. And actually, from the research, it suggests that distributed practice is far better for retention of skills, because the problem is when you learn a skill over a very short period of time, it actually is more prone to decay or fade. So the implication for driving for work is that if you have recently acquired a truck driving license and don't actually drive a truck for some weeks, then the danger is that your skills have faded, and it's important to keep those practice levels up so that you can learn and develop the skills over time.
Got you. So it sounds a bit to me in sort of my world where we do bits of training and things like that. We talk about people who come on a training course and they go away back into everyday life. If they just do that, their retention of that skill that they've trained is maybe single digit percentages. Whereas if they then go into the workplace and practice that skill, the potential of retention increases. And then if they are assessed and there's like some level of ongoing assessment and those kinds of things, then obviously they need to keep that standard higher, and there's added practice that they're getting. So this is really interesting, I suppose, for transport managers and fleet managers who are listening, because ultimately the worry, I suppose, is this prerequisite that actually to qualify to be a driver is to have the license, and often we're not actually checking the skill level, for example. So and potentially people might, you know, driving work in particular, people sort of come and go in and out of the industry.
Yeah.
So your findings are saying that potentially is posing a risk to the driver and to the organisation.
Indeed, and what the evidence suggests is that if you're not practicing those newly acquired skills for 3 weeks, that you start to see how performance declines, that people's abilities are affected. So if you're in a kind of job environment where you're not having to drive the truck very often, there's a potential source of risk there when you get behind the wheel when you've not had any practice for some weeks.
Got you. And so that is a bit of a concern. So what I'm assuming there's like a is there like a peak period of time, for example, that is a real concern? So when you were talking about sort of mass practice and distributed practice, is there like a period of time for distributed practice that is sort of ideal for being able to embed those skills?
Well, one of the interesting findings from my systematic literature review in this topic was that actually there's very little guidance that the evidence offers us here. What we do know is that funding in this field is very difficult to come by, so it's not really been investigated in any great detail. However, there are some general principles about that, answering that question, with regards to people who acquire a standard Category B driving license, in that in parts of the world, it's very common to learn to drive, but then not actually be able to afford to buy a car, for example.
Yeah.
And it's there have been some studies in these parts of the world where it's been shown that the skills are completely decayed pretty much within 6 months.
Wow.
So essentially, for a novice driver who has not developed a basic driving skill for Category B, then I would suggest that 6 months is the absolute bare minimum that you have for not driving. But for a truck driver who is actually driving a private vehicle, there is some practice going on, but not in the large vehicle that they drive for work. And the danger here is that you have an overdeveloped mental model for driving a car, and then when you jump into a truck, you can apply your the false mental model of driving a car and find it difficult to allow the brain to acclimatize to this new driving environment.
That's really fascinating, Lisa, because I've actually experienced that. I didn't know that that's what that was, but I've experienced that when a really good example was I nearly had an accident, and you'll probably laugh at this example, but it's very similar. I'd spent a whole day doing go-karting. I actually hate go-karting. I actually hate it. I don't really enjoy it. The smell of petrol and the heat and everything makes me feel travel sick. But nonetheless, I'd done a day of go-karting, and then I got back in my car and I nearly had an accident because the behavior of the car is so different to that of the go-kart. And I'd essentially, what you're saying is I'd sort of built this mental model of how this vehicle I was traveling in would behave. And the car obviously behaves totally differently. And this is what you're saying essentially with people who are driving. If they get used to driving a car or a van and they've lost this practice of driving that vehicle in the way that it physically behaves.
Yeah, and the good news is that it doesn't take too long to get back into the appropriate mental model and kind of, if you like, kind of get the neural pathways working appropriately. Although it's fair to say that initially what you shouldn't do is put yourself in a high risk situation whilst the brain is kind of adjusting to the change. So perhaps if you've not driven a truck for a while, make sure you keep your levels of risk really low, take it really slow, really do good observations before you make a decision about what to do next. And that should help to gradually allow the pathways in your brain, if you like, to start to develop into the right frame of mind for driving that vehicle.
Hello, it's Shani from Flagship Partners. We are really proud to sponsor the Fleet Geeks podcast. If you need expert advice or training for your fleet business, make Flagship Partners your first choice. We are really excited to announce the launch of our Transport Manager Academy. With expert development for fleet leaders, we offer fully accredited initial Transport Manager CPC training, CPC refresher, and operator license awareness training, as well as mentoring, support, and professional development beyond the qualification. Our vision is to develop elite fleet professionals.
Got you. And there's sort of three key stages to think about with this, isn't there? So one of them's the cognitive stage, which I'm assuming is this learning stage, and then the associative stage, and then the autonomous stage. Are you able to just outline those sort of three stages for listeners to help them understand it a bit better? Is that okay, Lisa?
Sure. So the cognitive stage is very much having to develop a very heavy kind of knowledge-based understanding about what is required of your abilities. You know, what kind of performance you need to demonstrate behind the wheel. So it's a very intense learning environment for your brain, if you like, and where you're sort of learning the rules and developing knowledge. And with the associative stage, what we're looking at here is a focus on linking stimulus with response, essentially, so that if this happens, then that happens. And that is something that comes with practice as you expose yourself to lots of different scenarios. And then the autonomous stage is where essentially it kind of bypasses the cognitive aspect of it, because you've built up that mental model and you're able to automatically make decisions that mean that you can respond much faster. And this is a kind of a typical learning curve, and typically we have this steep incline at the beginning as we're acquiring the skill, and then there's a kind of a plateau where it's very difficult to sort of improve your skill once you've acquired it, because you've acquired the skill. There's only so much. I mean, it's until you get into, go-karting or, race driving that you're starting to really develop different types of skills.
And that's, I guess that's kind of the thing, is that when I was then driving that go-kart, I'd gone back into this cognitive stage where I was very conscious of the way it handled and what it did and those kinds of things. So where I was potentially on autonomous stage, I've gone straight back to this cognitive stage, and that's really disrupted the way I've sort of processed that. And so I quite like that, because I'm quite visual. So we're sort of looking at this curve here of sort of going through this cognitive, associative, or autonomous sort of stage, and then essentially a skill fade is that there's a break in that cycle, isn't there? There's a break in this line, and what happens is you're not going to go back at the same point that you're at. You're going to have regressed. There's going to have been this fading process. So I was looking at your research, and it said that cognitive skills will need refreshing with 6 months of no practice. So and that's sort of this sort of key time period. So I think with fleet and transport managers, what would you suggest is good things for them to do to improve the skills with their drivers, to prevent that from being an issue, and if they are faced with someone who's maybe coming in that has had that, what are the sort of things we can do?
Well, like I said earlier, it's good news in the sense that it doesn't take too long for the skills to kick in, but what I would recommend is that if you have drivers that are not driving regularly and that do tend to sort of, let's say, be backup drivers who might only do deliveries when, people have not turned up or whatever, and, they have a license, but they hardly actually ever drive. These are the people that perhaps, rather than having them on the back burner, perhaps they could more regularly take part in shifts or schedules or whatever. That would help to keep the skill levels at an acceptable level.
Excellent. And then so I suppose that the other challenge is people returning to driving, is that fleet managers need to be super aware of this challenge and not just throw someone the keys and let them go. There needs to be this sort of not necessarily even, well, I think there should be some level of assessment, but science is proven that it's not just an assessment. There needs to be some level of coaching and support, I suppose, to be able to get people sort of through that cognitive stage again, to reduce the risk to them and of other road users.
Yeah, that's a good point, because in terms of behavior, we're looking at a different type of skill here. Skill that we've been talking about is very much vehicle handling skills, practical skills of driving. Has a perception, for example, is a practical skill. But what you're now talking about is a kind of more coaching, behavioral type of intervention, where you're providing feedback to the driver around their risk, rather than their skills as such.
Yeah, I think, and actually that's a really interesting differentiator, because I think a good driving assessment would do both. I think there's both the elements to it.
Yes.
I think there's so one of the things that we employ a driver assessor who goes out, and he tends to just chat to the driver the whole of, so they'll go on a route, for example, and it's not until on the way back that he starts coaching, so that it gives him the opportunity to properly assess the skill set, if that makes sense. So he's assessing the skill set initially before then looking to coach, because I think that is important, isn't it? Because you can almost intervene and change the behavior too soon without having seen it demonstrated, for example, I think is a challenge. But yeah, that's an interesting point. I've not really thought about it so much in that context before.
Yeah, coaching can be used for skills, but more commonly it's used to deal with attitudinal aspects, to deal with emotions in driving, deal with non-compliant behaviors, and it's more around making sure that you're influencing people's behavior, not so much checking on the distance to their vehicle in front, or tailgating, or using their mirrors properly. It's much more around the kind of ongoing, perhaps, lifestyle problems that might impact on people's driving behavior, like their sleep habits and so on. But we're getting back into the last podcast, so we'll move forward.
It's so interesting how it's so closely linked, though, isn't it?
Yes.
It is all so closely linked. And I think the one final question I guess I've got, which I think needs to sort of be a key, is how do we improve skills? How do we? Yeah, I think that's the right question, because we were talking about coaching, but yeah, is there how do we improve those sort of core functional skills or cognitive skills that people are using to drive?
Yeah, and this is something that has been a really major focus of some of the work I've been involved with, because it's all very well understanding what the risk is, but how do you improve? And some of the better strategies, and well evidenced, are hazard perception training, commentary driver training, expert commentary driver training. These are all interventions that have got a good, strong track record, showing that there is improvements in skill, certainly observational, anticipation skills, being able to respond quickly to hazards, are all excellent skills to embed. Obviously, from a behavioral perspective, there could be some time pressure problems, stress problems, that mean that no matter how well trained you are in these hazard perception skills, the stress that you're under, the pressure that you're under, everything goes out of the window effectively. And you have a tendency to not check your periphery, you get more tunnel visioned, you're kind of focused on the time, and you're not thinking about using your mirrors properly, and perhaps you might tend to drive too fast. And this is where the coaching side would come in, changing people's perceptions of, the kind of pressure that they're under, and whether it's real pressure or imagined pressure.
Of course. That's really, really interesting. It's very complex, isn't it? It's really very complex.
Yeah.
And I appreciate that in a 20-minute podcast, we're going to struggle to really barely scratch the surface. But nonetheless, I hope what's happened in this podcast is that the fleet managers, the idea is that they'll understand this language a bit better now about skill fade. There'll be some fundamental learnings around making sure that newly qualified drivers are properly catered for, inexperienced drivers and drivers returning, haven't had a break. There's some sort of thing that will trigger them thinking about that. And obviously in the show notes for this podcast will be your website at SciDrive. So I'm just going to point people towards that. If they want to find out more information, they can go to SciDrive, and I'm sure that you've got a wealth of additional stuff that hopefully will have piqued people's interest to come and have a look. So Lisa, thank you so much for taking your time out to record the second podcast with me. I really, really appreciate it, and it's been fascinating talking about skill fade with you. So thank you very much.
It's a pleasure. Thank you, Pete. Thanks.
Thank you. And thanks to the listeners for listening.
I hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you did, please share with your friends and colleagues too. Join us for free on Facebook with the Fleet Geeks community for transport and fleet managers. Fleet Geeks offers ongoing professional development, networking and mentoring too. So get in touch with me, Pete Rushmer, on any social media platform to find out more.